Many years ago, I heard a scenario called the libertarian nightmare. In it, a rich, powerful businessman really hates you. He doesn't initiate force against you in any way, but he tries to ruin your life. What can he do? For example, he can pay people not to hire you, not to sell food to you, not to work with you in any way. And what can you do about that under libertarian theory? He's not initiating force, so he's not violating your rights, so there's nothing to be done. Similar problems apply to objectivism, minarchy, and other systems that focus on limited government that protects people from the initiation of force, and as long as people's rights are protected, then the system is kind of done. That is capitalism, that's the free market. You're free to trade with people, but if someone offers you money not to, you certainly don't have to trade with them. Trade is voluntary. So no one is required, mandated to trade with you. You could make up another, less plausible nightmare. What if just no one wants to sell you food? Or any land to grow food on? Just for no reason at all. It just happens. What if, every person randomly picks some people to not trade with, who they just don't like for whatever reason, and by pure coincidence, every other person on the planet picks you as one of the people that they don't want to deal with. And you're not doing anything wrong, there's nothing you can change to fix it, it's just bad luck. So that is another scenario, but it's much less plausible, whereas a rich, powerful businessman who takes a disliking to you seems reasonably realistic. So what can libertarianism say to this? Well, if people are greedy, if they want profit and money, then they won't do it, because it's expensive and it doesn't provide a profit. You take a loss on harming someone in this way. So at least the incentives are against it. There's a downside to it. There's something to discourage it. So that's a positive. It's also unclear to me whether it would even be illegal today. There are some rules about discrimination, but I don't know the details. And you might have trouble hiring a lawyer if he's just paying everyone not to work with you. Another defensive thing is just having a lot of different companies. If you have a free market that is working well with many, many different companies you could do business with, then it is much harder for someone to go around and pay all of them not to work with you. I think the real solution is morality, but libertarianism kind of ignores morality or leaves it out of its political theory. I think there's a problem there, and that classical liberalism and objectivism are better on that issue, that they're more willing to talk about morality and say that to have a good society you need not just capitalism and freedom and protection of rights, but also to have moral neighbors. Have a good culture that teaches people to live in moral ways, so that not only are they prevented by police from initiating force, but they don't want to initiate force, and they don't want to starve you to death by paying people not to sell you food either, even if that's not illegal, though if that seems immoral to people, that is a protection against it. More broadly, there's a concern for libertarianism, capitalism, objectivism, etc. That what if people try to hurt you or make your life worse in some way without initiating force? How can you defend yourself? And do you need to defend yourself? If they aren't initiating force, maybe they're harmless. That is one of the positions people take, but I think it's incorrect. My view, in short, is that don't initiate force is like a set of rules, kind of like a board game has rules. So you can't do certain prohibited things. And if you want to hurt someone while not doing certain prohibited things, not breaking the rules, you just have to think really hard about it and find a loophole in the rules. Find some way to circumvent some of the rules. Find something bad that isn't prohibited. Unless the rules are either very simple or very complete or very perfect or something like that, you're going to find errors in them. And you're going to be able to take advantage of that. So one solution is to keep changing the rules, but that is problematic Because part of libertarian theory is that it's clear what is and is not initiating force so that people can actually know what not to do. And if the rules keep changing, that causes trouble. And libertarianism kind of says that we should have specific rules, that you cannot punch people and you cannot take their property and you have to follow your contracts and so on. And it says that set of rules is really good and is adequate, sufficient, etc. It doesn't need a bunch of frequent tinkering and tweaking and updating. And if you're updating it, then you have problems like who is doing the updating and why and when. Maybe the updates that help you will come very late. Maybe updates will be made in biased ways that actually hurt some people. You get into the problem of government power can be corrupt, it can be abused. So that would be a reason to stick to some simple rules and then leave them alone. However, if anyone can find any kind of loophole or workaround or problem with the rules that they can exploit, then you have a problem. And it's not just problems with the rules. So it can also be problems with you. If you have flaws, then if someone says the right word, you'll get upset, for example. Like, maybe you shouldn't be sensitive like that, but people aren't perfect. So someone can find something that doesn't violate the legal rules and will upset you, bother you, hurt you, because you have vulnerabilities. So even if there isn't a flaw in the laws per se, there just has to be a flaw in you, which they can trigger without breaking a law. So my view on creative adversaries, which are only bound by some relatively simple or static rules, but who deal with a complex situation, like you are a complex thing. There are many, many different ways to try to trigger you, upset you, bother you, etc. It's not like there are only two different ways to interact with you. An example of a simple system is tic-tac-toe. There are very few options. You can play your moves on the 9 different squares, and that's it. So because there's so little to the game, it's hard to find some sort of exploit. But people with their personalities are very, very complicated. So the rule don't initiate force is not adequate protection. Creative adversaries are always going to find something. If they have a lot of complex options and they're dealing with a complex system, they're going to find some way to accomplish their goals. It might be hard. The defender might have the advantage, but they can find something. And that is assuming that you do nothing to defend yourself. So you don't try to defend yourself at all. They find some vulnerability and then they hurt you. My view is if they put in enough effort and resources, they will win. Creativity is going to beat no creativity on the defensive side. If the aggressor uses creativity and the defender does not, the aggressor is going to win. So the obvious thing to do is use creativity to defend yourself. Think about how to be less vulnerable. Change your mind, personality, preferences, etc. to deal with various attacks. Use creativity to fight back. And that can work. However, it has major downsides. Now you're in a contest where the more creativity and effort they put in, the more work they put in to attack you without initiating force, then the more effort and work and resources you have to put in to defend yourself. There's no real limit to it. They can just they can try harder and harder and harder to do their aggression, and then you have to try harder and harder and harder to defend yourself. They can try to come up with different ways to manipulate you. And then you have to get better and better at not being manipulated. So it's work. And if they can put in work to make you have to put in work to defend yourself, then in some sense they're already winning because they've made you do work. They've distracted you from your life. They've taken part of your life away from you in a way. You don't get to just spend your whole life doing your art or whatever your career or hobby or whatever is. You have to take some of that energy and divert it away from your art into how to not be manipulated and so on. So that's a problem. There's a downside there. And my take on capitalism and the free market and so on is it's a good system or framework that allows problems to be solved. It doesn't cause disasters itself, but it's very incomplete for how to have a good life or good society or whatever. It doesn't just fix everything or create utopia like many, many pro-capitalist people seem to think it would. A lot of what protects you against non-force initiating aggressors is people not wanting to be like that, people being good people, morality, cultural knowledge of how to be a decent, civilized, reasonable, nice person. So things other than capitalism, other than political philosophy, other than the government, can help with these things. I'm not aware of any kind of libertarian theory that deals with this problem, that creative adversaries can find exploits to simple rules and find ways to hurt you anyways, as kind of a general abstract concept. A good example, an analogy, is computer security. Software is a complex system, and then hackers who are trying to break into the system and take control of computers, e.g. on the web, are the aggressors, and they have to follow a lot of rules. Like, all they can do is send data to the website, but they don't get to go there in person and press buttons on the computer. Would be an example rule. Now, there are different type of hackers who might go break into a building and physically access a computer, but you can do the remote hacking and follow the rules of only remotely sending data and find a way in. There are lots of cases where there are defined ways to access a system, like you can use certain functions, and then people find ways to hack the system only using those things. So the system itself got to define a bunch of parameters for how it's interacted with, and people following those parameters find a way to exploit the system and get unintended behaviors. So the way it works today in the real world, like real example, is that companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft spend a lot of money on computer security. They try to make Mac and Windows, Android and iOS secure against hackers. Everyone who makes a internet browser tries to make it secure against hackers. And it is a constant arms race. These companies have to spend money, have a security budget that's quite large every day. They have to keep putting effort into fighting the hackers. You can't just create some simple security mechanism and be done and stop thinking about the hackers. You have to keep spending money and effort to beat them. And it is a contest where sometimes they can get the lead or win in some way. But on the whole, Apple, Microsoft, etc. are doing pretty well and mostly winning currently with their huge budgets. They tend to stay one step ahead of the hackers rather than a step behind. In other words, most reasonable, competent people usually aren't getting hacked. The security is good enough that we're not just all getting hacked all the time. So security is primarily winning. The defenders have the edge. So your life is similar to a security system for software. You are a complex process with many different functions and moving parts and so on in your brain. And you have defensive mechanisms, the security code. And the hackers are people who are trying to get under your skin, trigger you, bother you, upset you, be mean to you, hurt you, etc. But who do not initiate force. They follow some rules. They can't punch you. They can only interact with you in limited ways, like putting some messaging out in the public. They can write a blog post. They can DM you on Twitter. They can send you an email. They have certain limited ways to interact with you. And with those limited ways, they can look for basically security holes. And if they find one, then they're going to have some control over you, some ability to harm you, control you, change you in a way that they want, whatever. And it's not as severe as with computer systems. Computers are not creative, and so if you hack into a computer system, you can often just get total, perfect, 100% control. Whereas when you find security holes for people, then you can manipulate them, pressure them, etc. But you don't just get total control. They do not become your puppet. You only get partial control, which still matters. So having creative adversaries is bad. It means you have to put more work into defending yourself creatively. if people would stop trying to hack into computer systems, then we could divert a bunch of creative effort, money, people's careers, etc., into other things, like developing self-driving cars or whatever else we want. It's a significant drain on resources to have these adversaries trying to do this. A lot of the computer hacking is actually illegal. There are laws against it. It is considered initiation of force. Not all of it, though. The crypto community is interesting because they have this idea code is law, and they have so-called smart contracts, where there are contracts between people that are governed by computer software. And so if you find a security hole, then basically you got all the money or get whatever you want out of the contract. The contract doesn't follow the spirit or intent. It follows the actual code, and if there's any kind of exploit possible, then someone can figure it out. And that is not illegal, probably, maybe. It's a downside to having really complicated contracts that might have security holes in them, and that try to be perfectly precise and literal and mathematical and whatever. Whereas normal contracts are a bit more vague and require interpretation, and so if there's a dispute, you might need a judge, but in significant ways that is safer. There's definitely there's risks to that too, because a judge could be unfair, biased, unreasonable, etc., and rule against you, and then you get screwed over. But when there's no room for interpretation, no room for judging and common sense, there's major risks that way too, that seem to, in practice, be bigger and more severe, generally. So being mean to people, finding ways to trigger them, upset them, get under their skin, or manipulate them is not illegal, mostly. And it certainly wouldn't be illegal under libertarian theory. Libertarians would just say, oh, if you don't like what they're saying, just don't listen to them. But my position is if you do not use creativity to defend yourself, and some adversary is using creativity to try to exploit or hack you, then you should expect to lose and get manipulated or screwed in some way. And this is going on a very large scale. It is a lot of what advertising is. A lot of advertising aims to be manipulative. It's not just trying to share accurate information about some product you might like. There's quite a bit of advertising like that, and it's important, but there's also a lot of advertising that tries to find some sort of weakness, some sort of bias or vulnerability you have, and then manipulate you to buy certain products. And they put creativity into that, and they have huge budgets. So if you have a large defender's advantage, like it takes 1,000 times more effort for the adversary, like they have to put in $1,000 of effort for every $1 you have to put in to defend yourself. Even with that kind of defender's advantage, you're in big trouble when you're dealing with a corporation that can spend $1 billion a year on advertising. Advertising is not targeted at you individually, personally. If it was, it'd be a lot harder to defend yourself. Instead, it's more efficiently targeted at groups. They'd rather have a 50% chance to manipulate 10 people than a 90% chance to manipulate one person, because they're going to get more people on average. That's part of why people aren't as bothered by it. It doesn't seem the same when they're trying to manipulate a group and they have a significant failure rate than when they're trying to manipulate a single individual person and they exercise more control. There's more reliability to their manipulations or aggressions if it's focused on a single person. So they put actual creativity and research into this stuff. I was reading a book by Russell Akoff, and he talked about doing consulting for beer companies. This is decades ago, in the 60s or 70s. And he helped them figure out how to advertise beer to manipulate people. He came up with a theory, a model of 4 different personality types. And he figured out how to do some effective ads that show basically people doing a personality type, then they show the beer brand, and then they show people doing a different personality type that personality type tends to change towards as it gets older. And they tested this, and they found it worked really well on people. That is just one little example of the types of manipulations they're doing. So the world is dangerous. People get manipulated all the time. They buy particular brands of beer for bad reasons, because the marketing is manipulative. The manipulation is often indirect, so people don't know that they're being manipulated or don't fully understand it. People often overestimate how well their defenses are working, or how invulnerable they are. The same thing comes up with reading the New York Times or many, many other publications. It's very biased, and a lot of people are like, well, I know it's biased, so I take into account the bias when I read it, so it's not tricking me. And then those people, most of them, get tricked quite a lot because it's more biased than they realized, or it's biased in ways that they didn't realize. People often get fooled by liars if the liars lie really, really strongly and severely because they assume no one would lie that much. So when they try to correct for not trusting the person, they make too small of a correction. They have too much of a charitable interpretation, too much goodwill and generosity, and so on. Which is actually a good attitude to have towards most people most of the time. So the cigarette companies, the food companies, the beer companies, the gambling companies, and many, many others have put a lot of thought and effort into how to manipulate people to use their products, even if it's maybe not a good idea. They often do this without regard for, is this actually good for you? Does it make people's lives better? They often sell products that are destructive or have significant negatives. And then they put a lot of effort to figure out how to get people to use more of this thing that's bad for them. Coffee companies are another big example. Milk, cheese, chicken, and vegetable oil are more examples of things that have been pushed on us, both by industry and government, so that our society eats a lot more of them. Also wheat, and corn, and soy, and rice. A lot of advertising tries to figure out what people want and why, and then say that their product offers it, even though the product does not. There's no actual connection between the product and the way it's being advertised. Like, they advertise beer as being suitable for a particular personality type, but they do not formulate a different beer for that personality type. They don't have a recipe of beer ingredients that makes it good for that personality. It's just marketing, it's just lying. I'll give a few more examples from food. They've done tests where they have chips with about equal amounts of fat, but one has like oil on the surface that people notice, and one has it inside. And then they ask people to estimate how much fat is in it and how many calories. And so they found people underestimate the fat if they can't see it, if it's not visibly oily. So they figured out they can manipulate people into inaccurately guessing the amount of calories they're eating, depending on how they make the food. They can have the same number of calories, but trick people about. Defending yourself against that takes effort, it takes knowledge. Another one is they found that people don't recognize the amount of fat in food as much if there's sugar. The sugar distracts attention away from the fat. So people don't recognize how much fat they're eating. So again, that's manipulative. It's trying to find a flaw in partly biology of how people taste things and to manipulate it. Similarly, they found that certain types of sugar, if you eat them, then you feel full and you stop eating, but other types of sugar do not trigger the biological mechanism to say, hey, you're full, stop eating. And so people will overeat sugar more if you use certain types instead of other types. And so they make food where they're trying to figure out how to get you to overeat their food. And it takes creativity to defend yourself against that. It takes effort and knowledge and so on, because these people are trying to manipulate you. And they're doing it on purpose. They're not thinking about mutual benefit. They are acting as creative adversaries. They are using their creativity to figure out how to get you to do something that is not what you want for yourself. They're trying to work against you to get a different outcome than the outcome that you want. And they're not trying to persuade you to change your mind and want a different outcome. They're trying to get you to get a different outcome that does not match your preferences so that you're disappointed, sad, so that you fail in some way. Possibly without realizing it, but would be sad and disappointed if you knew what had happened. So, the basic important point, creative adversaries are dangerous. If people are out to get you, and they do not initiate force at all, they are still dangerous. And if they're not out to get you personally, but they're trying to manipulate chunks of the population that include you, then that is a problem too. It's also possible to have help defending yourself. So, in order to defend yourself against cigarette marketing, you get a bunch of help from the anti-smoking campaigns that have spread awareness about downsides of smoking. Other people have put thought into what is wrong with smoking, and they've tried to share information about that and also manipulate people to not smoke. Like, they've done it partly in a manipulative way as well, where they're trying to manipulate you for your own good. There is an efficiency, a cost savings, when a group does anti-smoking activities instead of every individual having to figure it all out for themselves. But if you look at the world today, the number of offensive groups, and their budgets are much, much larger than the defensive advocacy groups like anti-smoking or anti-gambling. Our culture has no norm of subscribing to a bunch of defensive resources and paying them to actually find all the dangers in the world and tell you about them and give you short warnings that are lower effort for you. Like, outsourcing that kind of research is not a standard thing.